My husband passed away, and I went to the funeral alone. No one came. A day later, my son sold my husband's Navy SEAL medal to save my gold digger daughter-in-law's business. "She needs it more than you," he said. But when I made a call, "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined I'd be sitting alone in the front pew of St. Matthew's Church, staring at my husband's casket with nobody beside me. The silence was deafening. Even the organist seemed to play softer, as if she too felt the weight of the emptiness surrounding us. Frank deserved better than this. 43 years of marriage, and I was the only one who showed up to say goodbye. The pews stretched behind me like an ocean of abandonment, each empty seat a reminder of how invisible we'd become in our own family's eyes. I clutched my black purse tighter, feeling the worn edges of Frank's last letter inside. He'd written it 3 months ago when the cancer was winning and we both knew it. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were clear. "Viola, you've been my anchor through every storm. When I'm gone, don't let them make you feel small." The priest's voice echoed through the nearly empty church as he spoke about Frank's service to our country, his dedication as a husband and father. I wanted to scream that Frank had been so much more than the few generic words being spoken over his coffin. He'd been a Navy SEAL, a man who'd risked everything for people he'd never meet, but the stories of his real service, the missions that mattered, those were locked away in classified files that would die with him. My phone buzzed during the prayer. Ellis. My stomach turned as I saw his text. "Sorry, Mom. Nola's having an emergency with the salon. We'll visit the grave later." An emergency with the salon. My husband's funeral was happening, and my 38-year-old son couldn't tear himself away from his wife's beauty business. I turned the phone face down and tried to focus on the priest's words, but the anger was building in my chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Frank had always made excuses for Ellis. "He's finding his way, Vi. Give him time." But time had run out, and Ellis was still the same selfish man he'd become after marrying Nola 5 years ago. She'd transformed my sweet, albeit immature son into someone I barely recognized, someone who could miss his own father's funeral for a business crisis that probably involved nothing more than a broken nail dryer. The service lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes to honor a man who'd dedicated 26 years to military service and 43 years to our family. As the funeral director wheeled Frank's casket toward the hearse, I followed alone, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo my isolation. At the cemetery, the military honor guard performed their duties with crisp precision. 7 Marines in dress blues, their movements synchronized like a sacred dance. When they handed me the folded flag, the lead Marine looked into my eyes and said, "On behalf of a grateful nation, we thank your husband for his faithful service." A grateful nation. If only our son felt the same gratitude. I drove home to our small house on Maple Street in complete silence. Frank's coffee mug still sat in the sink from his last morning, 3 months ago, before the hospital became his final battlefield. I hadn't moved it. Couldn't move it. Some days, I'd catch myself making 2 cups of coffee, muscle memory refusing to accept that he was gone. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. Every corner held memories. Frank reading his military magazines in his recliner, working in his small office on what he called paperwork, though he never shared details. "Just tying up loose ends, sweetheart," he'd say when I'd ask. I was heating up leftover casserole when Ellis finally called. No apology, no explanation for missing the funeral. Just, "Hey, Mom, how did everything go today?" How did everything go? I wanted to ask him how he thought it went. I wanted to tell him that his father was buried by strangers, that the man who'd raised him deserved better than a son who prioritized a failing beauty salon over saying goodbye. Instead, I said, "It was beautiful. Your father would have been proud." The lie tasted bitter in my mouth. Good. "Listen, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come over tomorrow?" Something in his tone made my stomach clench. Ellis only used that particular voice when he wanted something, usually money. What's this about? Just some things Dad left behind. Nothing urgent, but we should probably go through his stuff together. Frank's stuff. As if 43 years of marriage and military service could be reduced to stuff that needed sorting through. Ellis, I just buried your father 6 hours ago. Can't this wait? Of course. I'm just trying to help, Mom. I know this is hard for you. Hard for me. Not hard for him, apparently. Not hard enough to show up when it mattered. After I hung up, I walked into Frank's small office and sat in his chair. The room smelled like his aftershave and the leather cleaner he used on his boots. His desk was meticulously organized, just like everything else in his life. Bills in one stack, personal correspondence in another, and in the bottom drawer, a locked metal box I'd never seen before. I'd never invaded Frank's privacy, never questioned his need for order and secrecy. Military men, especially ones like Frank, carried habits from their service years. But now, alone in the silence of our house, I wondered what secrets my husband had taken to his grave. The key was taped under the drawer, exactly where Frank would have put it, hidden but accessible. Inside the box, I found documents with official military seals, letters from the Pentagon, and photographs of Frank with men in suits I didn't recognize. But what caught my attention was a small velvet box containing Frank's Navy SEAL medal, the one Ellis had asked about last month. Dad's old medal, Ellis had called it. What's it even worth? I told him it was priceless, that it represented his father's service and sacrifice. Ellis had laughed. Everything has a price, Mom. Everything. Sitting there in Frank's chair, holding the medal that represented years of classified missions and unspoken heroism, I finally understood why my husband had been so protective of his past. Some things weren't meant to be measured in dollars and cents. Some things were sacred. But as I closed the box and locked it away, a chill ran down my spine. Ellis was coming tomorrow to talk about Dad's stuff, and something told me this conversation would change everything between us forever. Ellis arrived at 10:30 the next morning, which meant he was already half an hour late. I'd been awake since 5, unable to sleep, replaying yesterday's empty funeral in my mind like a broken record. When I heard his car in the driveway, I looked out the window and felt my heart sink. Nola was with him. She stepped out of their BMW wearing designer sunglasses and a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was heading to a lunch date, not visiting her recently widowed mother-in-law. "Mom!" Ellis hugged me at the door, but it felt forced, mechanical. "You look tired. This whole thing has been so hard on everyone." Everyone. I wanted to ask who this everyone included, since apparently it didn't include him yesterday when his father needed him most. Nola air-kissed my cheek, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and insincerity. "Viola, honey, I'm so sorry we couldn't make it yesterday. The salon had a complete disaster. The new girl flooded the entire back room. I was literally standing in 3 inches of water. She said it like it was a natural catastrophe, like her beauty salon emergency was equivalent to losing a husband of 43 years. I forced a smile and led them into the living room, where Frank's chair still held the impression of his body. "Coffee?" I offered, though what I really wanted was to ask them to leave. "Actually, Mom, we can't stay long," Ellis said, settling onto the couch beside Nola. "We just wanted to check on you and, well, there's something we need to discuss." Here it comes, I thought. I could see it in the way Nola kept glancing at Ellis, in the way he avoided my eyes. They'd practiced this conversation. "It's about Dad's things," Ellis continued. "I know this is sensitive, but we need to be practical. There are some items that might have value, and with the funeral expenses and everything." "What items?" I asked, though I already knew. Ellis shifted uncomfortably. "Well, his military stuff. Medals, uniforms, that kind of thing. I've been doing some research, and collectors pay good money for authentic military memorabilia." The blood in my veins turned to ice. "You want to sell your father's medals?" "Not all of them," Ellis said quickly. "Just the valuable ones. That Navy SEAL medal, for instance. I found a collector online who's willing to pay $15,000 for it." $15,000. I sat there staring at my son, this man I'd raised, who was putting a price tag on his father's honor. "Ellis, That medal represents years of your father's service. It's not for sale. Nola leaned forward, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. Viola, I understand this is emotional, but you have to think practically. Frank is gone. God rest his soul, but you're still here. You have bills, expenses. That money could help secure your future. My future is fine, I said sharply. Is it? Nola exchanged a look with Ellis. Honey, this house is old. The roof needs work. The plumbing is ancient. What happens when you can't maintain it anymore? What happens when you need care? The manipulation was so transparent, it was almost insulting. They were painting a picture of me as a helpless widow who couldn't manage without their intervention. But I'd been managing our household finances for 43 years while Frank was deployed or working. I knew exactly what our situation was. Besides, Ellis added, it's not like Dad's around to miss it. And honestly, Mom, you never even knew what half of his military stuff was about. He never talked about that time in his life. That was true. And it stung because Ellis knew it would. Frank had been protective of his military years, especially his time as a Navy SEAL. Classified was all he'd ever say when I asked about specific missions. But I'd learned to read between the lines, to understand that his silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about protection. He was protecting me from the weight of what he'd seen and done in service to our country. The medal stays, I said firmly. Nola's facade cracked slightly. Viola, be reasonable. It's just sitting in a box somewhere. At least this way it would serve a purpose. It already serves a purpose. It honors your father-in-law's service. A dead man's honor doesn't pay bills, Nola snapped, then immediately caught herself. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I just mean that Frank would want you taken care of. Ellis jumped in quickly. She's right, Mom. Dad was always practical. He'd want that medal to help you, not just collect dust. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to find some trace of the boy I'd raised. But all I saw was a man who'd been corrupted by a woman who measured everything in dollar signs. When had Ellis become someone who could stand in his father's house, 24 hours after his funeral, and try to sell his medals for cash? The answer is no, I said, and I'd like you both to leave now. Ellis's face hardened. Mom, you're being emotional. This is exactly why Nola and I think it might be better if we handled Dad's affairs. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Nola stood up, her voice turning sharp. Fine, but don't come crying to us when you're eating cat food and can't afford to heat this house. After they left, I sat in Frank's chair and cried for the first time since his diagnosis, not just for losing him, but for losing Ellis too. The son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw his father's sacrifice as a business opportunity. But as I wiped my tears, something hardened inside me. They thought I was just a grieving widow who could be manipulated and pushed around. They thought Frank's medals were just objects to be sold to the highest bidder. They had no idea what they were dealing with. I walked back to Frank's office and unlocked the metal box again. This time, I read through the documents more carefully. Letters from Pentagon officials, commendation reports, and something that made my breath catch. A letter dated just 2 months ago from someone called General Morrison. Frank, the letter began, I hope this finds you well. I wanted to reach out because we're finally able to acknowledge some of the classified work you did in Syria. The mission you led saved countless lives, including Ambassador Richardson's daughter. The Navy is considering posthumous recognition for several team members. Posthumous recognition. Frank had known he was dying when he received this letter. He'd known that his classified work might finally be acknowledged, and he'd never said a word to me about it. I picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. A crisp military voice answered, Pentagon, General Morrison's office. This is Viola Henderson. My husband Frank just passed away, and I found a letter from the general. I think I need to speak with him. One moment, please. The hold music played for less than 30 seconds before a deep voice came on the line. Mrs. Henderson, this is General Morrison. I'm so sorry for your loss. Frank was one of the finest men I ever served with. General, I need to ask you something. My son wants to sell Frank's Navy SEAL medal. He says it's worth $15,000 to collectors. There was a long pause. Then General Morrison's voice turned deadly serious. Mrs. Henderson, that medal is irreplaceable. Your husband saved the lives of 6 hostages in Syria, including a diplomat's child. What he did was classified for 23 years, but we were about to honor him publicly. That medal represents one of the most successful rescue operations in Navy SEAL history. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. General, my son doesn't know about any of this. He thinks it's just an old medal. Mrs. Henderson, if your son tries to sell that medal, he'll be in violation of federal law. More importantly, he'll be dishonoring a true American hero. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of Frank's office, finally understanding the full weight of what my son was trying to do. He wasn't just selling a medal. He was selling a piece of American history, a symbol of courage that had cost Frank more than Ellis would ever know. But there was something else in the general's voice, something that told me this story was far from over. I couldn't sleep that night. General Morrison's words kept echoing in my mind, one of the most successful rescue operations in Navy SEAL history. For 23 years, I'd lived with a hero and never known it. Frank had carried the weight of classified missions, of lives saved and lost, and he'd done it in silence to protect me from that burden. The next morning, I called General Morrison back. This time, I had questions. General, you mentioned posthumous recognition. What exactly does that mean? His voice was warm but formal. Mrs. Henderson, the Navy has been reviewing classified operations from the 1990s. Your husband's mission in Syria, Operation Desert Rose, saved 6 American hostages, including Ambassador Richardson's 8-year-old daughter. Frank led a team of 4 SEALs into a compound that intelligence said was impossible to breach. I gripped the phone tighter. What happened? 3 of his team members were injured in the extraction. Frank carried 2 of them to safety, then went back for the hostages. He held off hostile forces for 47 minutes while waiting for evacuation. The mission was classified because it prevented an international incident that could have destabilized the entire region. 47 minutes, the same amount of time as Frank's funeral service. The irony wasn't lost on me. The medal your son wants to sell, General Morrison continued, was awarded specifically for that mission. There are only 12 others like it in existence. It's not just valuable to collectors, Mrs. Henderson. It's a piece of military history. General, is there something else I should know? You sound like there's more to this story. A pause. Mrs. Henderson, your husband continued to serve our country even after his official retirement. He was a consultant on several classified projects. The Pentagon maintains a file on his contributions that runs over 200 pages. 200 pages. My quiet, humble husband who never talked about his work, who spent his evenings reading magazines and tending his small garden, had a 200-page file at the Pentagon. There's something else, General Morrison said. We've been trying to reach Frank for the past 6 months about a ceremony. The president wanted to personally thank the surviving members of Operation Desert Rose. We had no idea Frank was ill. The president. My husband was supposed to meet the president. Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to come to Washington? We'd like to honor Frank properly, the way we should have 23 years ago. After I hung up, I sat in Frank's chair and tried to process everything I'd learned. My husband wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL. He was a decorated hero whose classified work had saved lives and protected national security. And Ellis wanted to sell his medal for $15,000 to buy Nola a new car. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. Ellis. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I know you're upset, but I really think you should reconsider about Dad's medal. Ellis, we already discussed this. The answer is no. Mom, listen to me. I talked to the collector again. He's willing to go up to $20,000. $20,000, Mom. That's real money. $20,000. Ellis had found someone willing to pay more, which meant he'd been shopping Frank's medal around like a used car. Who is this collector? I asked. Just some guy who specializes in military stuff. He owns a shop downtown. Mom, this could really help us out. Us. Not me. Us. Ellis. What do you and Nola need $20,000 for? A pause. Well, the salon's been struggling, and we've got some credit card debt. Nothing serious, but this money could really help us get back on our feet. Credit card debt. My son wanted to sell his father's Medal of Honor to pay off credit cards that were probably maxed out on Nola's shopping sprees. Ellis, I need to tell you something about that medal. What about it? I almost told him about General Morrison, about Operation Desert Rose, about the president wanting to honor Frank. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the casual way Ellis talked about selling his father's honor. Or maybe it was the realization that my son had become someone I couldn't trust with the truth. It means more to me than you realize. Mom, Dad's dead. Keeping his medal in a box isn't going to bring him back. The coldness in his voice took my breath away. This wasn't grief talking. This was greed, pure and simple. Ellis, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you already sold the medal? Silence. Ellis? Mom, I can explain. My heart stopped. You sold it. I had to. Nola was about to lose the salon. The bank was going to foreclose next week. I didn't have a choice. My son had stolen his father's Medal of Honor and sold it without my permission, and he didn't have a choice. Ellis, that medal wasn't yours to sell. Mom, Dad's gone. You don't need it, and we needed the money. I thought you'd understand. Understand? Ellis, you stole from me. I didn't steal anything. Dad was my father, too. I had just as much right to that medal as you did. No, he didn't. Frank had left everything to me in his will. Ellis had no legal right to anything in this house, including his father's medals. But more than that, he had no moral right to sell something that represented his father's service and sacrifice. Ellis, you need to get that medal back. I can't, Mom. The sale is final. The guy paid cash and everything. Cash. Ellis had sold his father's Medal of Honor for cash, probably so there would be no paper trail, no way for me to track down the buyer. Who did you sell it to? Just some collector. Look, Mom, the money's already spent. Nola saved the salon, and we paid off our debts. It's done. It's done. As if Frank's legacy could be erased with a simple transaction. Ellis, I want you to listen to me very carefully. That medal represented your father's service in a classified mission. He saved lives with what he did, American lives. Mom, you're being dramatic. It was just a medal. Just a medal. My son had reduced his father's heroism to just a medal. Ellis, I need the name of the person who bought it. Why? Mom, just let this go. The money helped us. And Dad would have wanted that. Dad would have wanted his son to have integrity. Dad would have wanted his son to honor his service, not sell it to pay credit card bills. Ellis, if you don't tell me who bought that medal, I'm going to call the police and report it stolen. You can't do that. I'm your son. Right now, you're a thief who stole from his own mother. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Ellis spoke again, his voice was different, harder. His name is Marcus Webb. He owns a shop called Military Treasures on 5th Street. But Mom, he paid fair market value. You can't just demand it back. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of Frank's office and felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete betrayal by my own child. Ellis had not only sold his father's medal, he'd done it behind my back, with no intention of telling me unless I'd figured it out myself. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed I was just a helpless widow who would accept his theft as a done deal. He had no idea that I now had the Pentagon on my side. I picked up the phone and called General Morrison again. General, I need your help. My son sold Frank's medal to a collector named Marcus Webb. Mrs. Henderson, General Morrison's voice turned steel cold. That medal is government property. If Mr. Webb refuses to return it, he'll be in possession of stolen federal property. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I smiled. General, what do we do next? General Morrison moved faster than I'd expected. Within 6 hours of our phone call, he'd contacted the FBI's art crime team and initiated an investigation into the illegal sale of government property. But what surprised me most was his next call. Mrs. Henderson, I've been making some inquiries about your husband's financial situation. Did you know Frank was receiving a consultant's pension from the Pentagon? I almost dropped the phone. A what? Frank continued to work as a classified consultant for the Department of Defense until 2018. His pension should have been transferred to you automatically upon his death. We're talking about $4,200 per month, Mrs. Henderson. $4,200 per month. For the past 6 months since Frank died, I'd been entitled to a military pension worth more than $50,000 annually, and I'd never known it existed. General, Why wasn't I notified? The pension office shows multiple attempts to contact Frank at this address. Did he handle all the household mail? He did. Frank had always sorted through our mail, handling what he called official correspondence in his office while giving me the bills and personal letters. I'd assumed it was just his military habit of organization, but now I realized he'd been protecting me from knowing about classified income streams. Mrs. Henderson, there's more. Frank's life insurance policy through the military was separate from any civilian policies. You're entitled to $250,000 in death benefits. $250,000. I sat down hard in Frank's chair, trying to process what General Morrison was telling me. My husband had left me financially secure, and I'd been worrying about money while Ellis sold his metals to pay off credit cards. General, I had no idea any of this existed. Your husband was a very private man when it came to his military affairs. But Mrs. Henderson, here's what concerns me. If Ellis had access to Frank's mail, he might know about these benefits. The blood drained from my face. Ellis had been helping me sort through Dad's paperwork for months. He'd volunteered to handle the complicated stuff while I dealt with my grief. Had he been intercepting my mail? Had he known about Frank's Pentagon pension while convincing me to sell the house because I couldn't afford to maintain it? General, I need to ask you something. Could Ellis legally claim any of these benefits? Absolutely not. Frank's will designated you as sole beneficiary of all military benefits. But Mrs. Henderson, if someone has been intercepting your mail and forging your signature. I thought about Ellis's sudden eagerness to help with paperwork, his insistence that I didn't need to worry about the complicated financial stuff. I thought about Nola's expensive clothes and their new BMW. Had they been living off money that should have been coming to me? General, what do I need to do? First, we're going to get that metal back. I've already contacted Marcus Webb's shop. When he learns that metal is classified government property involved in a federal investigation, he'll return it immediately. Second, we need to secure your pension and death benefits. And third, his voice hardened. If your son has been committing mail fraud and identity theft, he's going to face federal charges. After I hung up with General Morrison, I did something I should have done months ago. I drove to the post office and spoke with our mail carrier, Janet, who'd been delivering to our neighborhood for 15 years. Oh, honey, Janet said when I explained the situation. Ellis has been picking up your mail for months. He said you were too grief-stricken to handle it yourself. He showed me a note saying you'd authorized him to collect everything addressed to you or Frank. A note. Ellis had forged a note authorizing himself to intercept my mail. Janet, I never wrote any note. Ellis has been stealing my mail. Her face went pale. Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping. He seemed so concerned about you. When I got home, I went straight to Frank's office and started searching through his filing system more thoroughly. In a folder marked Insurance, I found documents that made my hands shake. Ellis had filed a claim for Frank's military life insurance, listing himself as the beneficiary. The claim was for $250,000, and it had been approved 3 weeks ago. Ellis had stolen my husband's death benefits. I called General Morrison immediately. Mrs. Henderson, what you're describing is a federal felony. Mail fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft. If Ellis cashed that check, he's looking at up to 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. My son could spend the next 20 years in prison because he'd chosen greed over integrity. General, what happens now? I'm going to connect you with Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. She specializes in cases like this. But Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand something. Once we open this investigation, there's no going back. If Ellis has committed these crimes, he will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I thought about Ellis missing his father's funeral for Nola's salon emergency. I thought about him trying to sell Frank's Medal of Honor for $20,000. I thought about him calling Frank's service just a medal and telling me I was being dramatic for wanting to preserve my husband's legacy. General, my son made his choice when he decided to steal from his own father's memory. Agent Chen called me within 2 hours. Her voice was crisp, professional, and completely unsympathetic to Ellis's situation. Mrs. Henderson, We've frozen the fraudulent insurance claim. The money is being held pending investigation. We've also issued a federal warrant for the return of your husband's medal. Marcus Webb has already agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation. What about Ellis? We'll be interviewing him tomorrow morning. If he's smart, he'll get a lawyer. That evening, as I sat in Frank's chair reading through documents I'd never seen before, commendations, classified mission reports that had been declassified for my review, letters from grateful families whose loved ones Frank had saved, my phone rang. It was Nola. Viola, we need to talk. Ellis is panicking about some federal agents who want to interview him. What did you do? What did I do? I almost laughed at the audacity. I reported the theft of my husband's Medal of Honor and the fraud committed against his estate. Fraud? Viola, Ellis was trying to help you. You're being vindictive because you're grieving. Nola, Ellis stole $250,000 from me. He forged my signature on insurance documents. He's been intercepting my mail for months. Silence. Nola, are you still there? When she spoke again, her voice was different, scared. Viola, you don't understand. We used that money to save the salon. We bought equipment, hired staff. We can't just give it back. That wasn't your money to spend. But Ellis said Frank left everything to him. He said you didn't understand the financial stuff. Ellis had lied to his own wife about the inheritance. Or maybe Nola was lying to me now, trying to distance herself from the fraud. Nola, Frank left everything to me. Ellis has no legal claim to any of my husband's estate. Another long silence. Viola, please. Ellis made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to go to prison. Can't you just let this go? We'll pay you back over time. Pay me back over time. They'd stolen $250,000 and spent it on a failing beauty salon. And now they wanted to negotiate a payment plan. Nola, it's out of my hands now. The FBI is handling this. The FBI? Her voice went shrill. Viola, you called the FBI on your own son. I called the Pentagon about my husband's stolen Medal of Honor. Everything else followed from Ellis's own choices. After I hung up, I realized something had shifted inside me. For months, I'd been the grieving widow that Ellis and Nola had manipulated and controlled. They'd convinced me I was helpless, that I needed their help to navigate Frank's affairs. But I wasn't helpless. I was the widow of a decorated Navy SEAL, a woman who'd managed a household and raised a family while her husband served his country in ways I'd never fully understood. I was stronger than they'd given me credit for. The next morning, Marcus Webb called me personally to apologize and arrange the return of Frank's medal. His voice was shaky with fear. Mrs. Henderson, I had no idea that medal was stolen government property. Your son presented documentation that seemed legitimate. I've already turned over all records of the transaction to the FBI. Mr. Webb, what exactly did Ellis tell you about the medal? He said it was his father's, and that you'd agreed to the sale but were too emotional to handle the transaction yourself. He seemed genuinely concerned about your well-being. Even to strangers, Ellis had painted me as an incompetent widow who couldn't handle her own affairs, but his lies were about to catch up with him. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Agent Chen called with an update. Mrs. Henderson, Ellis has confessed to mail fraud and insurance fraud. He's agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'll serve a minimum of 3 years in federal prison. 3 years. My son would spend 3 years in prison because he'd chosen to steal from his own father's legacy rather than live within his means. What about the money? Full restitution is required. Ellis and his wife will forfeit all assets purchased with the stolen funds. The salon, their car, everything purchased with your husband's death benefits. Everything. In trying to secure their financial future by stealing from me, Ellis and Nola had lost everything they'd worked for. But there was one more call I needed to make. General Morrison, this is Viola Henderson. I'd like to accept your invitation to Washington. I think it's time Frank received the recognition he deserved. The FBI moved with a precision that reminded me of Frank's military efficiency. Within 72 hours of Ellis's confession, federal agents had seized the BMW, frozen the salon's business accounts, and placed liens on every asset purchased with my husband's stolen death benefits. Agent Chen called me with updates that felt like small victories in a war I'd never wanted to fight. Mrs. Henderson, We've recovered 93% of the stolen funds. Ellis and his wife spent approximately $18,000 that we can't trace, mostly cash withdrawals for daily expenses. The rest was tied up in business investments and luxury purchases. $18,000 in untraceable cash. That was probably what they'd lived on while convincing me I needed to sell Frank's metals to survive. What happens to Nola? She's cooperating fully with our investigation. Her attorney is claiming she was unaware of the fraud, but her signature appears on several documents related to the salon's financing. She'll likely face charges for accessory after the fact. I almost felt sorry for Nola, almost. But then I remembered her standing in my living room in her expensive coat, telling me Frank's honor didn't pay bills, and the sympathy evaporated. Marcus Webb delivered Frank's Medal of Honor personally the next morning. He was a small, nervous man in his 60s who kept apologizing and explaining how he'd been completely deceived by Ellis's documentation. "Mrs. Henderson, I've been in this business for 32 years, and I've never been involved in anything like this. Your son presented me with what appeared to be legitimate estate documents. He even had a notarized letter of authorization." A notarized letter. Ellis had gone to significant lengths to make his theft appear legal. "Mr. Webb, may I ask how much you actually paid for the medal?" He shifted uncomfortably. $12,500. Your son told me he needed the money quickly, so I offered him a lower price for a cash transaction. $12,500. Ellis had told me the collector was paying $20,000, but he'd actually sold it for $12,500. He'd lied about the sale price, probably planning to pocket the difference. "Mr. Webb, did my son seem knowledgeable about the medal's history?" "Not at all. He referred to it as Dad's old Navy thing, and seemed surprised when I explained its significance. Mrs. Henderson, if it helps, I never would have purchased that medal if I'd known it represented such an important mission." After Mr. Webb left, I held Frank's medal in my hands for the first time since I'd discovered it in his office. The weight of it felt different now that I knew the story behind it. This wasn't just metal and ribbon. It was proof that my husband had risked everything to save innocent lives. General Morrison called that afternoon with news that made my heart race. "Mrs. Henderson, I've spoken with the Secretary of the Navy. We'd like to hold a special ceremony to honor Frank and the other members of Operation Desert Rose. 3 of his teammates are still alive and they've agreed to attend. General, you mentioned survivors. What happened to the others?" His voice grew solemn. 2 team members died in combat operations years later. Frank was the last surviving member of the original team until his passing. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband carried the memory of that mission and the responsibility for his fallen teammates for over 20 years. 20 years of carrying that weight in silence." I thought about Frank's quiet evenings, his reluctance to talk about his military service, his insistence on handling official correspondence himself. He'd been protecting me from the burden of his classified past while dealing with survivor's guilt and the isolation that came with classified service. "General, there's something else I need to tell you. I've been going through Frank's papers more thoroughly, and I found correspondence about other missions." "What kind of correspondence?" I pulled out a folder I'd discovered hidden behind Frank's filing cabinet. Letters from families thanking him for saving their sons and daughters. Photos from reunions with people he served with. "General, there are dozens of them." "Mrs. Henderson, your husband never talked about those letters with his Pentagon contacts." He was remarkably humble about his service record. Humble, that was Frank. While Ellis was trying to profit from his father's single Medal of Honor, Frank had quietly maintained relationships with dozens of people whose lives he'd touched during his military career. The doorbell rang while I was still on the phone with General Morrison. Through the window, I saw Ellis standing on my porch, looking haggard and desperate. I hadn't seen him since Agent Chen's investigation began 5 days ago. "General, I need to call you back. My son is here." Ellis looked like he'd aged 10 years in less than a week. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd finally realized the consequences of his actions. "Mom, we need to talk." I let him in but didn't offer coffee or ask him to sit down. He stood in the living room, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, I know you're angry, but you have to understand. I never meant for this to get so out of hand. Out of hand. As if stealing $250,000 was something that had simply gotten away from him. Ellis, you committed federal crimes. You stole from your own father's estate. I know. But Mom, the FBI is saying I could go to prison for 3 years. 3 years. Nola's already talking about divorce. I'm going to lose everything. Everything. He was going to lose everything because he'd tried to steal everything that belonged to me. Ellis, you lost everything the moment you decided your father's honor was for sale. His face crumpled. Mom, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I'm still your son. Doesn't that mean anything? I looked at this man. My son, the boy I'd raised. The child Frank had been so proud of, and felt a sadness deeper than anything I'd experienced since Frank's death. Ellis was my son, but he'd become someone I didn't recognize. Ellis, you missed your father's funeral to help your wife with her salon. You tried to sell his Medal of Honor without understanding what it represented. You stole my mail, forged my signature, and committed fraud against your own father's estate. You did all of this while telling me I was too emotional and incompetent to handle my own affairs. Mom, I was trying to help. No, my voice was steel. You were trying to help yourself, and when I discovered what you'd done, you lied about the sale price and tried to keep the difference. Ellis went pale. He hadn't known I'd spoken with Marcus Webb. Mom, how did you— Ellis, I'm not the helpless widow you and Nola thought you were manipulating. Your father left me very well provided for, and I have resources you never knew existed. For the first time since he'd arrived, Ellis really looked at me. I could see him processing the changes. My posture was straighter, my voice was stronger, and I was speaking to him like an equal instead of a child seeking approval. Mom, what resources? Your father was receiving a consultant's pension from the Pentagon worth over $50,000 annually. He left me a death benefit worth $250,000, the same money you stole, and General Morrison has informed me that as the widow of a decorated Navy SEAL with classified service record, I'm entitled to additional benefits and support. Ellis sank into Frank's chair, his face white with shock. Mom, I didn't know about any of that. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You assumed Frank was just a regular veteran with a few old medals. You never bothered to learn about his actual service record or what his sacrifice meant. What do you mean, sacrifice? I pulled out the folder of letters and photos I'd been showing General Morrison. Your father saved lives, Ellis, not just in Syria, but throughout his career. These are letters from the families of people he rescued, photos from reunions with teammates whose lives he saved. Your father was a hero, and you tried to sell his legacy for $20,000 to pay off credit cards. Ellis read through several letters, his hands shaking. When he looked up at me, tears were streaming down his face. Mom, I didn't know. If I'd known what that medal really meant. Ellis, it shouldn't have mattered what it meant to anyone else. It should have mattered what it meant to your father. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Mom, is there anything I can do? Any way to make this right? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Ellis, you're going to prison for 3 years. That's the consequence of your choices. When you get out, you'll have to rebuild your life from nothing. But if you want to make this right, you can start by learning who your father really was. I handed him the folder of letters and photos. Read these, all of them. Learn about the man whose legacy you tried to sell. And when you get out of prison, maybe we can talk about what it means to honor his memory. Ellis clutched the folder against his chest and nodded. Mom, will you visit me? I looked at my son, this broken man who'd lost everything because of greed and poor judgment, and felt my heart soften just slightly. Ellis, you're still my son, but trust is earned, and you have a long way to go. After he left, I called General Morrison back. General, I'm ready for that ceremony. It's time the world knew what kind of man Frank Henderson really was. The Pentagon ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 months after Frank's lonely funeral at St. Matthew's Church. As I walked through the corridors of the world's most powerful military headquarters, wearing the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, I felt Frank's presence beside me in a way I hadn't since his death. General Morrison met me in the reception area, his dress uniform pristine and his manner both formal and warm. Mrs. Henderson, you look beautiful. Frank would be so proud. General, I still can't quite believe this is happening. Mrs. Henderson, this ceremony is 23 years overdue. Your husband deserved recognition while he was alive to receive it. The ceremony was held in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, a sacred space lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients. As I entered the hall, I saw 3 men in dress uniforms standing at attention near a display that made my breath catch. Frank's military portrait, enlarged and mounted on an easel, showed him as a young Navy SEAL with serious eyes and a slight smile. Beside it, a plaque detailed Operation Desert Rose and Frank's role in saving 6 American hostages. Mrs. Henderson, General Morrison said softly, I'd like you to meet Frank's teammates. The 3 survivors of Operation Desert Rose stepped forward, and I was struck by how much they resembled Frank, not physically, but in their bearing, their quiet dignity, their respectful attention to protocol. Ma'am, I'm Commander James Torres, the first man said, extending his hand. Frank saved my life in Syria. I've carried shrapnel in my leg for 23 years, and every morning when I wake up, I think about how your husband carried me 300 yards to the extraction point while under fire. The second man, introduced as Master Chief William Drake, had tears in his eyes. Mrs. Henderson, Frank and I served together for 8 years. He was the finest man I ever knew. When I heard what happened with your son, ma'am, I want you to know that the entire Navy SEAL community stands with you. The 3rd survivor, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Santos, had been the youngest member of the team in 1997. Mrs. Henderson, your husband taught me what it meant to be a warrior and a protector. Everything I accomplished in my career, I owe to Frank's example. As we stood in that hallowed space, surrounded by the portraits of America's greatest military heroes, I finally understood the full weight of what Frank had carried in silence. He hadn't just been my husband, Ellis's father, or even just a decorated veteran. He'd been a leader, a mentor, and a guardian whose influence had shaped the lives of countless people. The ceremony began with a military honor guard presenting colors. As the American flag was raised and the national anthem played, I thought about Frank's empty funeral and felt a profound sense of justice being served. This was how a hero should be honored, with dignity, respect, and recognition for service that went far beyond personal glory. General Morrison delivered a speech that revealed details about Operation Desert Rose that had been classified for more than 2 decades. In September of 1997, a diplomatic convoy was attacked in Syria. 6 Americans, including an 8-year-old girl, were taken hostage by a terrorist cell that demanded the release of prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. The situation was considered politically impossible. Any official military response would have caused an international incident. He paused, letting the weight of the political complexity settle over the audience. Frank Henderson volunteered to lead an unofficial rescue mission. The Pentagon could not acknowledge the operation. If the team was captured or killed, the United States government would deny their existence. Frank understood that he was risking not just his life, but his identity, his legacy, and his family's future. I gripped the program in my hands, understanding for the first time why Frank had never spoken about this mission. He'd risked everything, including the possibility that I might never know what happened to him. The mission succeeded because Frank Henderson demonstrated leadership under fire that exemplified the highest traditions of the United States Navy. When his team came under attack during the extraction, he held defensive positions for 47 minutes while waiting for evacuation. 2 of his teammates were wounded, and Frank carried them both to safety before returning for the hostages. 47 minutes. The same length of time as Frank's funeral service, which I'd attended alone while his heroic past remained hidden from the world. The 8-year-old girl Frank saved that night grew up to become Dr. Sarah Richardson, who currently serves as a pediatric surgeon at Walter Reed Medical Center. She's saved hundreds of children's lives, carrying forward the gift Frank gave her 23 years ago. A young woman in a military dress uniform stepped forward from the audience. She was in her early 30s, with serious eyes that reminded me of Frank's intense focus. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Richardson said, her voice steady but emotional, "your husband gave me my life back. Every child I save, every family I help heal, is a testament to his courage. I've wanted to thank him for 23 years. She handed me a letter sealed with medical center letterhead. This is for your husband. From all the families whose children I've been able to save because he saved me first. The Secretary of the Navy then stepped forward with a posthumous commendation that elevated Frank's existing Medal of Honor to the highest level of recognition. Frank Henderson's classified service record shows 43 separate missions over a 26-year career. He saved 87 American lives in documented operations, and his influence on military tactics and hostage rescue protocols continues to protect Americans today. 87 lives. My quiet husband, who read magazines and tended his garden, had saved 87 people during his military career. As the ceremony concluded, General Morrison presented me with Frank's updated military honors and a flag that had flown over the Pentagon in his memory. But the most meaningful moment came when Commander Torres approached me privately. Mrs. Henderson, there's something else you should know. Frank kept in touch with many of us over the years, always checking on our families, offering support when we needed it. When my son was struggling with addiction, Frank flew to Colorado and spent 2 weeks helping us find treatment. He never talked about his own problems, never asked for anything in return. He just showed up when people needed him. Frank had flown to Colorado to help a teammate's son while battling his own cancer and never mentioned it to me. Even while facing death, he'd continued serving others. The reception after the ceremony was attended by dozens of people whose lives Frank had touched, fellow veterans, family members of people he'd rescued, military officials who'd worked with him on classified projects. As I moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and sharing memories, I realized that Frank's legacy was far greater than I'd ever imagined. Agent Chen approached me near the end of the reception with an update on Ellis's case. Mrs. Henderson, your son was sentenced this morning. 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. Full restitution has been ordered, and all assets purchased with stolen funds have been forfeited. 3 years. Ellis would serve 3 years for trying to sell his father's honor for $20,000, while surrounded by people whose lives Frank had saved. Agent Chen, what happens to Nola? She's agreed to a plea bargain, 6 months in minimum security prison, 3 years probation. She's also being required to pay restitution for her role in spending the stolen insurance money. 6 months for Nola, 3 years for Ellis. The woman who'd manipulated my son into stealing from his own father's estate would serve minimal time, while Ellis would lose years of his life for choosing greed over integrity. But as I looked around the Pentagon reception, watching Frank's teammates share stories of his courage and leadership, I realized that justice wasn't just about prison sentences. Justice was Frank finally receiving the recognition he deserved. Justice was his true legacy being preserved and honored instead of sold to pay credit card bills. Dr. Richardson found me again before I left. Mrs. Henderson, I know this might sound presumptuous, but I'd like to establish a scholarship fund in your husband's name for children of military families who want to pursue medical careers. A scholarship fund. Frank's legacy would continue helping people long after his death. Dr. Richardson, I think Frank would love that. As I drove home from Washington that evening, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since Frank's diagnosis. My husband's heroism was finally public knowledge. His medals would never again be sold to pay someone else's debts. His memory would be preserved in scholarship funds and military histories. But most importantly, I was no longer the helpless widow that Ellis and Nola had tried to manipulate. I was Viola Henderson, the proud widow of a decorated American hero, and I had found my own strength in defending his legacy. The house on Maple Street felt different when I arrived home. Frank's chair still held his impression, his coffee mug still sat in the sink, but the weight of secrets was gone. In his office, I placed the ceremonial flag and updated military honors beside his original Medal of Honor, finally understanding the full significance of what Frank had left me. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from Ellis at the Federal Correctional Facility where he was serving his sentence. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and reminded me of the boy who used to write thank you notes after every birthday and Christmas. "Mom," he wrote, "I've been reading Dad's letters and photos every day. I understand now what I tried to sell. It wasn't just a medal. It was proof that heroes exist, and I had one living in my house my entire life. I'm ashamed of what I did, but I'm grateful you stopped me before I destroyed something irreplaceable. When I get out, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of being Frank Henderson's son." I folded the letter and placed it in Frank's filing cabinet, next to the folder of testimonials from people whose lives he'd saved. Ellis had a long journey ahead of him, but for the first time since his arrest, I felt hope that my son might eventually find his way back to the values Frank had tried to teach him. That evening, as I sat in Frank's chair reading one of his military magazines, I thought about the empty funeral that had started this entire journey. Frank had been buried by a handful of strangers while his true legacy remained hidden. But sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly, in the spaces between public recognition and private honor. Frank had spent his life protecting others without seeking glory. Now, finally, the world knew what I'd always suspected, that I'd been married to a hero who measured his worth not in medals or money, but in lives saved and promises kept, and I was his widow, which made me stronger than anyone had realized. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.